Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Kurtis Findlay. He's the co-editor of the new book, Chuck Jones, The Dream That Never Was, which reveals that the animator best known for entertaining us with Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Elmer Fudd also spent decades trying to bring a character named Crawford to life. Stick around. Turns out that Looney Tunes wasn't all, folks. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of second-rate cartoon characters who live out their lives of quiet desperation in Toontown without ever having been drawn by the hand of a master craftsman like Chuck Jones in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Pronoun trouble. That's the name of the very first piece of art my wife and I ever bought together. It was a framed animation cell, number 101 of 300, featuring Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck in an argument. Big surprise. It's signed by legendary animator and multiple Academy Award winner Chuck Jones and authenticated, for whatever that's worth, with a seal from his daughter, Linda Jones. Now, Mimi and I spent what, for us, was then a small fortune to buy it. We hung it prominently in our living room for many years, and when Rachel was born, it moved to her room. And just recently, we reclaimed it, and it hangs proudly in our bedroom. Although if you look just over my shoulder, if you're watching on TV, it's right up there for the purposes of this interview. Now, we didn't buy it as an investment. I'm a writer, she's an editor. Pronoun trouble just spoke to us both. Now, so much has been written and said about Chuck Jones, including not one but two autobiographies, that it's hard to imagine there's anything new left to say or to show. And yet there is. In the beautiful new book, Chuck Jones, The Dream That Never Was, animation fans will be delighted to discover an entire missing chapter in the artist's catalog. Crawford, a would-be cartoon and comic strip character that never quite hit its mark despite more than 2 decades of Jones trying. Dean Mullaney and Kurtis Findlay, working with the Jones family, have reconstructed the animator's life from the 60s and 70s, along with a trove of finished and raw Chuck Jones art and sketches that tell the Crawford story in pictures and gags. And with that, Kurtis Findlay, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you here. It's an amazing book, but maybe you can do better justice to describing what you have here than I did.
Well, you did a pretty good job, actually. It's essentially, it started off just wanting to collect the comic strip. I had heard nothing about it except for one line on Wikipedia in Chuck Jones's entry that said he did this comic strip in the 70s, and I wanted to know more about it. So I did a little bit of digging and some research and found that no one else knew anything about it either, including the own syndicate at Chicago Tribune. So I went to Chuck Jones' family. They have an art gallery that deals a lot with his artwork, which is where you got your artwork, and they wanted to do the book as well. Because no one had shown an interest in Crawford before, and it's an interesting little part of Chuck Jones's career. It really is only a footnote compared to the vast amount of animation he's done. But still, it has some merit, and it's worth looking into. And so the book expanded when I started doing research. When I found out that he originally had the character in mind for a series of TV shows throughout a period of 20 years or so before he finally got the idea to do it in a comic strip, or the opportunity rather to do it as a comic strip. And so that is the story that's within this book. It's how he came up with the character and the journey that he took before he finally got the newspaper deal.
And so you were the provocateur in this. You made this happen. It wasn't the estate at all.
No, not at all. Yeah, they've had this artwork sitting in their archives for a long time and didn't really know what to do with it. And a couple of them are framed and on display, but they don't really. Yeah, they had no idea what to do. So when I had the idea of collecting it into a book, they jumped at that chance because, frankly, it's probably the only time this will ever see print.
So tell us, now hearing that, I want to know a little more about your background. How did you happen to take this interest? Were you a Chuck Jones or an animation fan, or?
Yeah, I am a Chuck Jones and an animation fan. I have been, like most people, was an animation fan when I was a kid, but for different reasons. And as I grew up, started to realize the art and the craft behind it, and then in more recent years, the incredible wealth of history that dates back to 100 years ago. And I've been fascinated reading books about animation in the 30s and 40s, and of course that's when Looney Tunes and the old Mickey Mouse shorts and Woody Woodpecker and such, they all had their heyday. And that's when Chuck Jones was at his most prominent as well. And from there, I've also gained an interest in comic strips of the 30s and 40s as well. And I was happy to see the two meet. Um, there's a publisher, the Library of American Comics, who deals with a lot of these comic strips, reprints, really nice hardcover archival quality reprints like Little Orphan Annie and Dick Tracy. And when I had the idea of Crawford, they were the publisher that I first had in mind. And so I pitched it to them, and luckily for me, they loved the idea too. Dean Mullaney also being a huge Chuck Jones fan.
So, yeah, I was going to ask you now, where does Dean fit into all this?
Dean is the owner of that company. He started it with his friend Bruce Canwell, and they both have a huge wealth of information and resources with really old comic strips.
Hmm.
They just love putting these books together and doing the research and letting people know the history behind them. And a lot of comic strip artists are also animation fans. It's not a huge leap to be a fan of both, and they both love Chuck Jones as well. And so they were a huge help in getting this book off the ground.
Well, and I mean, I know Dean's name, and comic book fans who go back a little ways, as I do, will know his name from being one of the first indie publishers. I think back in the '80s, and he's been around comics as a fan and as a publisher, an editor, and a writer for a long time. Now, had you done a book before?
No, this was my first time. I've done some writing just for various blogs and such, but this was my first attempt at publication, which is pretty exciting. Um, and yeah, like I said, Dean was incredibly supportive the entire way and was a huge help in teaching me the process of this, which was very, very interesting.
And where are you geographically? I'm afraid I didn't ask you that before.
I'm in Canada. I'm in Vancouver.
Very good.
Yeah, and Dean is in Florida. He lives probably over by your end, because you're in Florida too. And
Yeah.
so all of our communication was over email and some phone calls, and their publisher IDW is in California. So it was a I never got to see any of them. It's interesting how things work in this day and age.
Well, so tell me about the origins of this again in more detail. So you've read a little bit that something called Crawford is out there. You don't really know what it is, and you reach out to the estate first, and you're probably thinking, oh, they're going to ignore me. They're not going to be interested in this. But why is it do you think that they took an interest in the? I mean, you're coming to them with little experience at this, and yet you've got this idea.
Well, the person I mainly talked to is Chuck Jones's widow, Marion Jones, and she's very involved with the company. And the thing that she kept on saying over and over was she really enjoyed my enthusiasm, and that's probably one of the main things. Is someone who came to them who maybe wasn't as enthusiastic wouldn't have got the deal, but they really liked my passion and um, the ground research that I did before contacting them made them realize that I was serious about this and knew what I was talking about. I also had gone to the syndicate to make sure to see who had the rights to the comic strip. Was it Chuck Jones or was it the syndicate? And me being in contact with them meant they didn't have to be in contact with them. So I was doing all the work, and they really didn't have to do anything at all except let me see the artwork and scan it in.
And what do you do in your day job? How do you make a living?
Well, actually, I'm a stay-at-home dad of two, and my wife works in the animation industry. She's at an animation studio called Nerdcore Entertainment. They make a lot of TV shows. One of their most popular is The League of Super Evil. You can look that one up. But yeah, she works, and so that frees me up to have a little bit of spare time when I'm not running around after my children to do projects like this, which was really fortunate.
Very cool. Um, and how do you put Crawford in perspective for someone who may not be a big either Chuck Jones fan or an animation fan, but finds this interesting that something could actually be uncovered that had not been seen before? Where does it kind of fit into his body of work?
Well, it's let's see, this was made in 1979. That's when the strip was published. And so by that time, he'd long finished with Looney Tunes. The Warner Brothers studio had decided that these theatrical shorts starring their main characters were not worth the time and money that they were putting into it. So they closed their studio. And from that point, um, Chuck formed his own studio called Tower 12, and that's where he made a series of Tom and Jerry cartoons. He worked on a couple of TV specials for MGM, like, of course, his most famous TV special, How the Grinch Stole Christmas with Dr. Seuss. And it was during this time that he started developing Crawford into a comic strip. The strip itself stars mainly two kids, but it's a group of children, and they are sort of a more intellectual than usual breed of children. The main child, Crawford, he does a lot of um, introspective thinking and talking about life and how the world works and how kids relate to the world in a kid way. And his friend Morgan is a little bit more naive and questions things and is generally a much more of a kid figure. Crawford is, I guess, maybe more of an adult as a child. But the two of them go through life and have their friend circles that they deal with. It's very much like Peanuts, but Charles Schulz had a much better grasp on how to handle a comic strip than Chuck Jones did, which is one of the reasons why Crawford didn't last very long.
Well, and I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, can we cast kind of a critical eye on Crawford for a moment without upsetting you or the estate? It one of the things that struck me was that most of the characters who were not named Crawford actually seemed more fully drawn, if you will, than Crawford himself. They seemed I could connect to them a lot more easily in reading this than I could to Crawford.
It is interesting how, yeah, Crawford is probably the most bland character out of all of them. It is true, and Crawford himself has gone through many different iterations. If you read through the story, he changed dramatically from when he began to where he ended up in the newspaper strip. In fact, Morgan is a lot more like where Crawford was in the beginning. Um, so Morgan is definitely the more interesting character. In my opinion, the comic strip should have been called Morgan, as he was the more interesting one. In fact, the Sundays were labeled Crawford and Morgan because I think people connected with him a whole lot more.
Yeah, it was just weird. I mean, Crawford was not really the most likable character in there, and the thing I noticed was that it seemed like it's very well written. There's some very clever stuff in there, but the characters just needed. I hate to say it because you spent so many years already on it, but it either needed more time to develop, to be properly placed, I think, as a comic strip or even a cartoon, or it may be one of those cases where he really needed a partner in there to kind of temper him a little bit or to kind of push him back. I don't know. That was just my thought.
Yeah, and I talked with his editor for a bit, the editor from the Tribune, and he did try to help Chuck Jones along that line, but I think sometimes um, Chuck could feel pretty pretty important, so he probably didn't accept a lot of that help. Um, yeah, like most strips, they start off a little rocky, especially for first timers, and they often do take a year or two to really fully realize themselves. Um, and if you go back to the early days of Peanuts, they're very different than how we ended up even 5 years later. Um, they just need that time to develop, and Chuck didn't have wasn't given that time, or didn't give himself that time. It's unclear as to which one that is.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be tough to be the editor of Chuck Jones, either in animation or uh, certainly in a syndicate, where even though you've been dealing with some pretty strong creative people. I want to say that in the right manner of respect. But here's Chuck Jones. I mean, oh my God, Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, etc., etc. It's hard to imagine that that even if you have a ton of experience, you can look at Chuck Jones and go, "Yeah, oh, I've still got a thing or two I could teach you, sir." You know.
Yeah, for sure. And he was a pretty strong personality. I mean, he was an incredibly nice guy. Only having read his stuff, I never met him myself, but um, yeah, he was probably um, maybe a little difficult to give criticism to, especially when you realize the legacy that he's already, even in the 60s, has already established.
And it's interesting to note here that I mean part of what you dug up here was that Crawford started, I think, as a character. It was intended to be a character in the Roadrunner cartoons, right?
Yeah, and that was the most interesting part because one of the most obvious conclusions that a lot of people make is that Crawford is a descendant of Ralph Phillips, one of Chuck Jones's one-off characters from the 50s. He was in a cartoon called From A to ZZZZ and another one called Boyhood Days. Um, and you can see a lot of similarities. And so in my research, I wanted to take a look at Ralph and draw those comparisons. So when I did some digging in their archives into the history of the Roadrunner cartoon, I was quite surprised to find Crawford's name in the material there, and that's when I started looking into it a little bit deeper to try and find where else he pops up. But yeah, he was created for the Roadrunner show. If it had taken off and it was created to be uh, fully formed, then Crawford would have been the kid next door. He would have been more like Morgan, like I said, and naive. He would have been clumsy, kind of the character where he touches things and misfortune happens all the time. Um, and he would have run with the circle of friends with Ralph Phillips and his gang.
And Roadrunner and Coyote, super genius, Wile E. Coyote, would not have been the same.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, so even there was somebody who had the I don't know, who had the smarts to say, Chuck, don't really see the kid in these cartoons.
Well, and only the pilot was made, and at that time, yeah, all of those plans that Chuck had were just on paper, and then Warner Brothers closed down their studio, so that show was never made.
And did anyone in the family? Did you get a sense? I mean, you're probably just dealing with Marion primarily, but did you get any sense that anyone in the family was against doing this, and that it was not his? Again, I say with all due respect, this was not his best work in his career. It was just something. It seems like it's something that he just had this love of, and he really wanted to make happen. But it really wasn't the high quality Chuck Jones work that most people might expect.
Right, yeah. Actually, the family was not against it at all. They met it with enthusiasm as well. And for them, keeping Chuck Jones's name alive is their main goal. They want to make sure that the world today still knows what he did way back then. And that's why they keep on dealing with his artwork. And anytime there's a new idea for a book, I'm sure they'll be happy to take a look at the idea. And the thing about this one is that it is a showcase of his artwork. It's not a critique or a history of his career. It's new stuff, which is always exciting for people. And the thing I like the most about the book is that the strips, we scanned the strips from original art, most of them. A couple of them we couldn't find because they'd been sold off or whatever. But most of it is the original artwork, and we scanned it in so you can see his blue pencil line, and you can see the mistakes that he made and the rearranging of the letters and the panels and all of this stuff, which is incredibly interesting from the point of view of behind the scenes of a comic strip artist, but also that's not a side of Chuck Jones's art that's usually seen as well. Usually you get his finished, polished work, or maybe a little bit of his rough pencil line, but not to this extent. And I think that's really exciting.
It's very cool. Having worked, I was thinking about what you said before about the estate. Having worked many years with the Will Eisner estate, I know they have a pretty similar approach. That, if they encounter a trove of unseen work, they want to share it, and they're not really against showing things that are in the kind of the work stages, that ash can kind of stuff. Um, so I'm kind of curious. Is there more? Did you find more stuff? Is there enough material maybe to do another book of Crawford or something else, perhaps?
Yeah, there's a lot of material in their archives. They have a whole warehouse full of Chuck Jones art, which is remarkable, and most of it hasn't been looked through for years. I'd love to get down there and have another look. Um, there's a lot of projects that Chuck Jones developed when he was at his own company, just which was all distributed by MGM, eventually owned by MGM. And there are a lot of projects that he was developing that never saw the light of day, and they're just kind of sitting in boxes in their warehouse. One of them was really interesting when he had the deal with Dr. Seuss to do the Grinch and Horton Hears a Who. They actually developed a bunch of different cartoons based on his books at that time. Eventually, only two of them were made, and then Dr. Seuss went on to work with another of Chuck Jones's old Warner Brothers co-workers, Friz Freleng. But he developed a bunch of these adaptations, including one by one of Dr. Seuss's most rare books called The Seven Lady Godivas.
I don't know that one.
And if you know Lady Godiva, she's a character who was famous for riding nude on a horse. And so this book featured seven Lady Godivas, and it's a very odd book for Dr. Seuss. It was his only foray into the world of, adult cartoons, but like not adult in the terms of it being erotic or anything like that. It was still a funny, tasteful book, but not for kids. And they started dealing. Chuck and he started developing an adaptation based on that book, which was an odd choice, and you can probably understand why it didn't really end up getting made.
Yeah, unless it was going to come out from Ralph Bakshi and
Yeah,
in
right.
the Fritz the Cat line.
Yeah.
All right. And so, having this completed, you thinking about doing another project now? Now that you've got your feet wet?
Yeah, there's a couple of other things I'd like to do. I don't know if I'm allowed to say anything or not, but I mean, there's nothing really final.
Okay.
What I'd love to do is a book based on some of Ward Kimball's artwork. Ward Kimball is one of Disney's nine old men.
Oh.
He did a lot of he designed and animated Jiminy Cricket. That's one of his claims to fame, and the Mad Hatter Tea Party and such. And so he is an incredible artist, and he did a lot of work, cartooning work outside of Disney, and a collection of his artwork and a little bit on his life would be a really interesting book. He's got a biography coming out this September, so I'm eager to see what's in store in there and how maybe a book can complement that one.
Great. Well, get it done and come see us again.
You bet.
All right. Well, folks, listen, you can find Chuck Jones, The Dream That Never Was, edited by Dean Mullaney and Kurtis Findlay, in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. There it is, and of course, people will be seeing it throughout the show. Kurtis, do you have a website, or is there anywhere you'd like to send people online to learn more about yourself or Chuck or the book?
Yeah, there's a website, chuckjonescrawford.com, and we have some rare artwork and things up there. I guess I should update that a little bit. I haven't updated it for a while, but and there's also a Facebook page, Chuck Jones Crawford. No, actually, Chuck Jones, The Dream That Never Was. You can look it up on Facebook, and we post some some scans and lots of unusual artwork too. In fact, you can see some of the storyboards from Seven League Godivas on that Facebook page. So yeah, go check that one out.
Very cool. Well, Kurtis Findlay, very interesting stuff. Thanks for finding it for the rest of us, and thanks so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For more original interviews, surf over to our main website, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. If you've enjoyed today's show, subscribe for free to Mr. Media via email, RSS, or iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Another good idea? Download our new free Mr. Media mobile app in the Android market. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many parts of the Internet. Show your support of Mr. Media by supporting our sponsors, including Audible. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/radio. Again, that's audibletrial.com/radio for your free audiobook. We're also supported by thepartyauthority.us. Call DJ Ira for all your party entertainment needs nationwide at 1-800-DIAL-DJs, or visit their website, thepartyauthority.us. If you've got an idea for a guest, a comment on today's show, or would like to advertise on Mr. Media Radio, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. You can also call our 24-hour listener line at 1-727-498-4711. Some messages may be used in an upcoming show. And unless you live next door to Mr. Media, there may be a toll charge. You can also follow Mr. Media on Facebook, Twitter, or our new YouTube and Vimeo video channels. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, this is Bob Andelman from Mr. Media. First of all, I want to thank you for years of support listening to this show. We're starting our 6th year, it's hard to believe, our 6th year as 2012 starts, and heading towards our 1,000th online podcast, audio and video. It's pretty amazing, frankly. I remember starting it several years ago thinking, this will never last. And podcasts, that's as stupid a word as blogging. But here we are, starting our 6th year and heading up to 1,000 interviews. And I want to thank everybody for listening and supporting the show. I also want to tell you that one of the things that's been very helpful for this show is Stitcher Radio. Yes, this is sort of a commercial. Now, there are millions of smartphone apps in the world, but I only use one several times a day, Stitcher Radio. I build my own radio station to listen to broadcast and online shows when I want and in the order I want. CNN News Update, Onion Radio News, WTF with Mark Maron, MSNBC's Morning Joe, Studio 60, the TechCrunch headlines, and of course, Mr. Media. It's free. It works on iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, Palm Pre, and much more. And you can get it for free for yourself. Try it out. I guarantee you're going to love it. Stitcher.com/mrmedia. That's Stitcher.com/Mr. Media. You're going to love it. And thanks again for supporting the show.